on how this came to be. We at the Illinois Family Violence Coordinating Council, we are under the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority, and received the grants to encourage arrest policies and enforcement of protection orders through the Office of Violence Against Women. We first received an award in 2011, and with that 3-year award, we developed or really updated the model protocols for domestic violence, as well as violence against people with disabilities and violence against older adults. So we did protocols for both law enforcement as well as prosecutors and updated those. And throughout our circuits, judicial circuits, and local councils in Illinois, we did trainings on those protocols. In 2014, we received another grant for the grants to encourage arrest policies and enforcement of protection orders, or what we call the arrest grant. And with that, we expanded our reach for these trainings, and we developed 4 different mini-toolkits. 3 we have previous webinars on and trainings. Those were court personnel, emergency medical services, as well as probation. And today we're presenting to you 911, which is one of the 4 mini-toolkits. So the intention or the intent of these mini-toolkits is for the local council training teams they have in the last year or so been bringing on board members from those expanded disciplines, so 911, probation, EMS, and court personnel. So they brought them onto their training team, talked to them a little bit about what the protocols were about, and initiated them into what the council does. And so we then are rolling out the mini toolkits. So they will go now out to their local councils and do trainings with 911 telecommunicators and those that are associated with that, and they will do these trainings. So this webinar is going to be somewhat of a train-the-trainer style. We like to model what the presentation should look like, but we also we will have some information about the training and giving you some tips and advice moving forward. So my name is Mary Ratliff. I'm the Program Director with the Illinois Family Violence Coordinating Council. I will be presenting today with 2 911 telecommunicators. The first one is Francesca I know I'm sorry, Francesca. Mazurkovic. Did I say it right? Mazurkovic. Yeah. I'm so sorry. So Francesca is a 911 telecommunicator. She has 19 years of experience at the Chicago Office of Emergency Management and Communications. For the last 12 years, she has been an instructor with OEMC's training division, and most recently she's taken the role of a policy writer for OEMC, Research and Development. We also have Betsy Smith. Betsy has worked at MCAD, the Champaign County 911 Center, for 26 years. She was hired as a telecommunicator 1 and frequently trained new telecommunicators in that position. She has been a supervisor for 17 years, working with second supervisor to oversee 30 police and fire dispatchers. She's also handled policies and procedures, Freedom of Information Act requests, and recordings for court, as well as the Premise Alert Program. She attended the University of Illinois, graduated with a bachelor's degree in teaching of Spanish. She currently holds certifications in emergency medical dispatching, quality assurance, communication training officer, telecommunication emergency response task force, and crisis intervention team. And both Francesca and Betsy were they were members of the work group that helped develop this toolkit. So let's talk a little bit about the toolkit. First of all, there are 4 sections to each of our toolkits. We divided it into, the first section is really the title section pages or in the introduction. So for those of you that wanted to print them out and put them into nice books or binders, we had those for you so it's visually attractive and organized. The second part is a quick reference guide component, and that was really something that if you had someone new come on as a 911 telecommunicator, this could be a sheet that they have with them at their desk, so they could look at it and get some tips and advice, but it really was sort of a summary or a quick reference. The third component is the training component, including the PowerPoint and handouts, and that's what primarily we'll be going through today. And then the fourth component is the resource component. Now, there is a lot of overlap between the training component and the resource component. Many of the same handouts are in the resource component, but we wanted to make sure that we covered everything in each of those sections. So let's talk a little bit about the training team. First of all, you want to bring onto your training team, like we talked about before, a 911 representative from your community. And that could be a 911 telecommunicator, a 911 supervisor, a 911 trainer. I'm telling you, in this work group, I learned a lot about 911 and the different, first of all, it's very different across the state of Illinois what 911 might look like, what their center might look like, what resources they have available, and then who the employees are, who is taking the 911 calls. And so it might look different in your community. You want to make sure, though, that you had a representative from your community to be on that training team. The idea is that we want them to teach their own. We want someone to come in from 911 and be teaching 911 and training them on this toolkit. Ideally, we would like to have 2 or 3 of the following protocol training team members to present as well. And so this is how we're modeling today. Betsy and Francesca are 911 telecommunicator representatives, and I am going to take the role as a DV advocate. I've actually had, before my role here at IFVCC, and before my role even with the state, I worked for several years, about 10 to 12 years, as a DV advocate and a legal advocate for sexual assault victims. And so I'm going to be taking on that role today. Also, possibilities for people on your training team could be law enforcement, representative from the disability or older adult agency, and a prosecutor. So someone who's already on the training team be present with that. And it may look different in each community. It just is really who has the skills, who has the time, and who's best for that presentation. I first off want to, before we really get into talking about the tips for training, with this presentation, what I want to talk about is anytime in the chat box, anytime you have a question or a problem, you can go into the chat box, which is over on the right-hand side of your screen, and type it in. Sal Perry is from ICEJA, and he's helping us with the webinar today, and he's going to be looking over that chat box and making sure that we pay attention to all of your comments. I want to make sure that everybody can hear can hear us, and if at any time you can't hear, please type into the chat box, and Sal will let us know, and we can bring our speakers closer or microphones closer and try to do whatever we can so everybody can hear. So tips with training. First of all, with the toolkit, in the training section, there are notes on every PowerPoint. So the work group was very good about not only creating a PowerPoint that had great information and handouts, but also notes that can help guide a trainer. And so there's suggestions of topics to expand upon, handouts to use with each slide, as well as resources that might be available or examples or activities that they could use in their presentation. We have handouts associated, like I said, with with the PowerPoint, and again on the slide in the notes section, it lists the handouts that would be appropriate for that slide. We encourage the local training teams to customize the PowerPoint for your local area, and so you'll see, especially at the end of the presentation, it talks about different resources in the community, such as family resources or DV resources, disability resources. And so we want to make sure that you were able to go in there and you can customize that and actually include your local resources in the presentation. It's also encouraged that at the presentations, at the trainings that you do, that you have local brochures or some sort of handout or takeaway that they can have, that they could contact their local center or their local resources if they need further information. We encourage audience participation. So today on the webinar, there's not going to be much audience participation. We will take time to answer questions in the chat box. But in your trainings, we really encourage you to look at those notes, look at those activities, encourage questions, have some dialogue going on. I think a lot of people learn if they're discussing it and talking about it and practicing it in different ways. Answer questions periodically and then at the end of the presentation. And so I have inserted, so you'll see that our PowerPoint looks a little different from what's in the toolkit. And again, we've customized it for this presentation, but we encourage you to put the question slides in. So insert a couple slides where you can take a break, answer some questions, or if you have a break actually in your presentation, maybe a 15-minute break or something like that, you can insert that into the PowerPoint as well. But we feel like it's best if you answer questions as you go rather than saving them to the end. And you can have better context if you're answering the question really when that subject arises. You want to include information on domestic violence, abuse against people with disabilities, and abuse of older adults. So with the protocols, the model protocols, we separated those into three. There was the DV protocols, there was the people with disability protocols, and then there were the older adult or elder abuse protocols. What we tried to do with the Mini-Toolkits is include all of that information into this and not separate it out. So you'll see there's just one toolkit. There's not a toolkit for DV, people with disabilities, and older adults. There is just one. And so we've included information about all of it throughout the presentation. So I am going to go ahead. I'll stop. I know we don't have a question slide, but if anybody has any questions about the training, I can take a minute or so to answer that if there's any. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hand it over to Betsy.
Good morning, everyone. As 911 call takers, our very basic job at its core is to take a call for help and send the appropriate response. So many times in our job, that call is a single event, like a robbery or an assault or a car accident. But we find that family violence, or what we call domestics, those are very different. It's just a whole different animal. We find often that those are a series of events that you will deal with the same people over and over and over again, but there's always that first time that somebody reaches out for help. And so one of the things that we want to stress is that it's a process. It's not a one-time event and it's over. You'll find that you'll get the calls from the same people, and each time there may be a little bit something different. We find that the situations do escalate over time. So if you're used to dealing with the people that are calling today, you may find that this call there's something different. There's something worse about this one. As a 911 call taker, it does tend to get kind of frustrating to have the same callers call in about the same thing on a frequent basis. But we just have to remember that the way we handle these calls, it's very important to those families, it's very important to those callers, because if they encounter resistance when they call for 911 help, that if we're not very helpful to them, if they do encounter resistance, it makes them less likely to call back the next time. Maybe the next time will be worse and they will decide not to call based on our actions. So one of the things that we'll be discussing later is how the abuser manipulates the victim by putting up barriers. Can we go to the next slide? Thanks. The first time that that a victim has contact with services is usually when they're in crisis, although that may not be the only time. What we find is that sometimes people call just for information, and again, if they encounter resistance or if they don't get the help they're looking for, they're less likely to call back when they need it next time. So one of the goals of this training is to provide you as call takers with the additional information to guide your response to them when they do call. The victims are looking for assistance. They're looking for you to guide them in the right direction. And if they find that the people on the other end of the phone are uncaring or not very empathetic, or they don't get them to the right places for help, that they're less likely to call back again. As 911 dispatchers, we need to think of ourselves as the link between the victim and the responding officers, like it says on the slide there, that we can control a little bit how they feel about calling the police.
All right, so as we know, family violence, relationship violence is a serious crime. The violence might take the form of violence against a partner, but as we've also talked about, it can involve persons with disabilities, elder abuse, sexual assault, and or stalking. As we also know, law enforcement has the opportunity to stop this escalation of violence. Again, family violence is an ongoing crime, so the officers are often dealing with the same people. We as call takers or telecommunicators, we are often dealing with the same people as callers. And what we know is that there are no stereotypes when it comes to domestic violence. Victims and abusers come from all economic and education levels, all racial and cultural groups, all genders, abilities, religions, and ages. Family violence happens in all types of families and relationships. The faces of family violence look like the faces we see here of our neighbors, coworkers, friends, teachers, coaches, anyone in our community. Since many family violence calls are not identified as such, we as telecommunicators need to evaluate every call for family violence.
So to identify signs of possible indicators of family violence, it's helpful that we understand what the issue is. Many people think that family violence, domestic violence, violence against people with disabilities or older adults, this is really about physical violence or someone just losing it. They lost control, maybe it was an anger management issue, but it was just someone who was so angry and they lashed out. Really what we found is that's not the case at all, and it's quite the opposite. Physical violence often masks this true issue about what's going on, and so it may look like this violent incident where a person loses control, but actually family violence is the opposite. It is about power and control. The person that the abuser is actually using power and control over the victim, and they will do this intentionally, strategically. It's customized to fit that victim, and it's very goal-oriented. So I often use the example of if when someone says to me, oh, well, that person was just drinking and they lost control, they're really angry, they had a hard day, they lost their job, whatever it might be, and that's why they abuse the victim. So I often ask them, well, if that was the case, then why are they not abusing? Why didn't they lash out and beat up their neighbor or their boss or, the store clerk? No, it's very intentional that they are controlling the victim. And so what we have here is the power and control wheel. And this wheel, if you look on it, on the outer side, we have the physical violence, the sexual violence on the outside. But in the inside, we talk about the different ways in which someone might use power and control over a victim. So in the spokes, we see things like using intimidation, using emotional abuse, using the children, economic abuse is something that happens frequently, coercion, threats, blaming, denying, minimizing, and really the core of all of this is power and control. So the abuser may do things intentionally, and it's not out of control. They may do things intentionally to gain power and control over that other person. An example might be that they may introduce substances to get their partner hooked and dependent on them for supply, and then they threaten to call DCFS and get their children removed because of the drug abuse. And so there's a lot of things that are going on that goes beyond the physical abuse. He's beating her up. We have an actual, I'm going to find it here. There is a handout associated with this slide that we can use. And what we encourage you to do at this point in the presentation is to hand out or to talk to the audience without the handout first, but to talk to the audience about power and control, and then maybe separate them into groups, divide them into small groups, and have them talk about and assign each of them a spoke in the wheel, and have them talk about what might be involved in that spoke of the wheel. What are some examples that they could give? What might that look like? And then halfway through, you give them the power and control wheel handout. So that's this handout you see here on the screen. Oh, I'm trying to get back to the, sorry. There we go. So that's the activity that you might stop to use. And then after each group has this discussion about the different examples involved in the power and control wheel, and goes through the handout, then they talk to the full group and talk about what they came up with, and have a good group discussion about it. So it's a great activity. It's a great way. Also, it's a good way for presenters to get an idea about what the audience, what your participants, what their knowledge is, what they're thinking about, what information about domestic violence or family violence do they already have? What do they know about power and control? So power and control, what might it look like for a person with a disability or an older adult? Very similar to the power and control wheel that we showed you previously. However, they oftentimes abusers oftentimes use their disability or their age as a mean to control them. So the tactics may be different depending upon the relationship with the victim and the abuser. So for instance, with a person with a disability or an older adult, it may be a family member that is the abuser, or it could be a caregiver or a child. It might be someone that's hired to take care of them. And those relationships all fall under the Illinois Domestic Violence Act, and so we've included them with that. So it just depending on what that relationship would be, it may look a little different. With this slide, we also have a handout that's associated with it. This is the power and control wheel for elders and people with disabilities. And so this gives you a better understanding of, again, it's similar to the power and control wheel that we had in the previous slide. However, this is a little more geared towards people with disabilities and older adults. You could use a similar activity that you did with the power and control activity if you had time. So what kind of tactics do you think an abuser might use for people with disabilities and older adults? So there's several. Again, they're outlined in that power and control wheel. They may withhold care, deny basic needs, such as assistance with bathing or dressing, getting out of bed, medications, eating. Again, these people rely upon their caregivers, or they may rely upon that abuser to help them with just some basic things that they need to survive and to live in the world. They may threaten to end that relationship and leave that person unattended. So again, that's very manipulative, and it's often like an emotional abuse tactic. What would they do without that person being there to help them? They may threaten to have that person institutionalized, and oftentimes this is the last thing that someone who has a disability or an older adult wants to do, is to be institutionalized in a nursing home or whatnot. They want to stay in their home and function as long as possible. in that environment. Threaten to take away any services they may be receiving. Also taking away assistive devices. So this could be like taking away their wheelchair or their hearing aids or walkers, communication boards, accessible phones. We see this a lot of times when it's someone who does not have a disability or is not an older adult, that they would maybe take away the phone, and that leaves them helpless that they can't call for help. But taking away these assistive devices with someone who might rely upon them, again, for everyday needs, is very abusive. And then exposing the disability. So this person may not want the world to know that they have a disability. It could be a mental illness. It could be AIDS. And so threatening to expose them is a part of emotional abuse. Other tactics may be that they blame the disability or the age for abuse. So again, this is very strategic. Again, the bruises might be in places where it may look like someone fell down and they could blame that on them. Oh, well, they don't get along very well, and so they fell down, and this is where they fell. That's how they got this bruise. Forced sex, when an individual may be unable to physically resist. Sexual assault is often, it is always about power and control. It's not usually about sex. Uses medications to control, and we can see this either way. Either they're holding back their medications so they're not functioning well because they're not getting the medications that they need, or they could be over-medicating them as a way to control them. Misuse of power of attorney or seeks guardianship, and so this again, if you have power of attorney or guardianship, that's a role of power that you have over that person to begin with, and so misusing that to their advantage. Oftentimes economic abuse might be involved with that, but again, is very abusive. And then isolates and won't let others in the house, won't let them go out. So oftentimes they are stuck. They have no means to get out of their house or have others come in. And so this isolation, which we see in a person without a disability or who is not an older adult, the isolation is a way so that they can't get help, and that control that abuser has over that person is more effective. 911 relies upon caregivers oftentimes for a picture of what normal is. So they may talk to a person on the phone that is the caregiver, and you just want to watch this. Be cautious or aware that caregivers or family members may paint a picture of normal, and it'd be to rationalize indicators of abuse. So like we said, someone's hurt themselves because they fell. It might be from being pushed or being abused, but they're blaming it on that disability. So we're going to stop here for just a minute or so and stop for any questions. If you have a question, you can go ahead. Everybody is muted. But if you have a question, you can go ahead and type into the chat box over to your right, and we'd be happy to answer anything you may have. Okay, well, it doesn't look like anybody has anything. Again, feel free throughout the presentation, if you have a question, just go ahead and you can type it in the chat box, and we'll be able to respond to you as soon as possible. And I will hand it over to Francesca and Betsy.
Okay, again, as we mentioned just a little while ago, a domestic or family violence call may not always present that way. A caller could be contacting 911 for medical help for an injury. So how did it happen? That's one thing that we always ask. How did it happen? Getting the details, the answers to that question could give us some insight as to whether there could be a family violence element there. Same thing with theft report from a family member. You know, the victim doesn't want the person arrested, just kind of wants their belongings back. And the caller doesn't want their partner outside their work, doesn't want to talk to them. You know, well, why is that? If someone calls and says these things, well, why is that? Why don't you want to talk to this person? It's your partner. Why all of a sudden do you not want to talk to them? What caused this? And there could be some stalking, abuse, or intimidation involved.
One more thing also on this slide is that we find sometimes that callers provide us with as little information as necessary to get the response from the police or the EMS services. So as 911, it's up to us sometimes to ask the right questions to help fill those gaps. We may not even know there is a gap until we start asking some of those questions. So sometimes using the open-ended questions to get more details is very helpful. And if they're vague with their answers, sometimes then we ask ourselves, well, could there be a valid reason for them being vague? And is there something else that we don't know about this call yet?
So oftentimes, talking to the victim, we can tell that the person is fearful, anxious. Could be as a result of the abuser using coercion and threats. Victims are also reluctant to respond when questioned or hesitating in providing info. As Betsy mentioned, victims may provide vague responses to these questions and give explanations that don't add up. This is especially true if the abuser is in close proximity. So what we need to remember as 911 telecommunicators is that we are in their life, we are in this caller's life for just a moment. The victim is more concerned about what's going to happen after the call or after the police respond, after the incident. Abusers are skilled at being able to intimidate victims in the presence of others, so threats may go unnoticed by unsuspecting bystanders. So all of these reasons can lead the victim to deny, minimize the situation, or even appear reluctant and even uncooperative. Some of their responses can seem flat or detached. We get some idea that the caller may be injured or unhealthy. And I had a personal experience with a 911 call probably 15 years ago, it's maybe been about that long. I was taking calls, and I had a woman caller, and she, as soon as I answered, she pretended that she was speaking to a girlfriend on the telephone. She said, "Oh, hey girl, how are things?" And at first I was a little confused. I was about to say, "Ma'am, did you mean to call 911?" But I let her talk for a second, and then she said something to the effect of, "Oh yeah, well, yeah, he's here, yeah. Oh, things are okay." And so then something just clicked, and I asked her, "Is everything okay there? Is there someone there who's giving you a hard time? The police need to come to maybe remove this person?" She said, "Oh, yeah. And so she was just very vague in her answers. And but like Betsy said, by asking the right kind of questions, I was able to get out of her that her partner was there and was causing some kind of crisis for her, so she needed him to be removed. But the whole time that we were on the phone, she never once made any kind of, she played it off as if she was speaking to a girlfriend the entire time. So as telecommunicators, and this is an example I use in training classes here at OEMC with our new call takers, I always give that example of how we really need to listen to what is being said and what is not being said. We kind of have to read between the lines, if you will.
And sometimes, even if you ask all the right questions and they answer them the way you expect them to, it still doesn't provide you the complete story or complete picture of the scenario. I think if you're in this business long enough, we all have calls, like what Francesca just described. My personal call that I had, again, many, many years ago, just like hers, was that we had a 911 hang-up call, and it was from a landline when those were popular. And when I called it back, I got a woman, and I explained that this is 911. We just had a call from your phone, And she's like, oh, yeah, it was a mistake. You know, I was cleaning or something like that. And she seemed out of breath. And I noticed that. And I asked her, I'm like, well, ma'am, why are you out of breath? And she said, oh, I'm pregnant and I was just running for the phone when it rang. And, you know, it made perfect sense. Her answer, it came out. She didn't falter at all when she said it, and everything seemed just fine. Luckily, we have a policy at our agency that if we received a 911 hang-up call from a landline, even if we called it back, we were still to send responders out to check. So I did that. I made a dispatch ticket. The officers go out there. They knock on the door. And she's like, no, I'm fine. You know, it's just I was running to get to the phone. I'm pregnant. I was just out of breath. And the deputy took it a step further, and he said, ma'am, do you mind if I come in and look through the house? And what they found when they came in and looked through the house was that her, I think he was older teenager, maybe young adult son, was in the house. He was hiding in a closet because he had just battered her. And she answered all the questions that I asked. There was no indication in her voice that there was a problem. And luckily for me in this case and for her, I followed the policy, and the deputy was diligent when he got there, and they were able to get her out of that situation. So I think that, you know, we find all types of calls when it comes to domestic violence.
At this point, I want to, just because it seems appropriate right now, I'm going to skip forward a couple slides because both of the stories, Francesca and Betsy, that you shared are similar to, we have an example. So a couple slides forward, if you go to this, and in your presentation, you might want to have this up and available, and we do, when you are doing the training. But we have some good examples of calls, and they are through this website. The one we're going to present to you today is called Newport News. It's about a woman who calls and then changes her mind. So I'm going to go ahead and play this. Give me 1 second. We do a little improvisation today with this, so be patient. Here we go.
Newport Emergency Dispatch Radio 6. Yes, I do. I want to police the 395 plane. Okay, what's going on there? Hello? No, I'm sorry. I disregard that call. Okay, I'm just angry. Ma'am? No, it's okay, honest. Who else is there with you? No, it's all right, please. You sound very upset when you call. I know. I'm having a temper tantrum. I'm sorry. You sure you don't need the police? Positive. Okay, ma'am. Okay. Hello? No, this is Newport News Police Communications. Yeah? I was talking to a lady there. Is it 395? Yeah. May I speak to the lady I was talking with a minute ago? What do you want to talk to? Hello? Ma'am? Yes. I was just a little bit concerned about your welfare. This is a police dispatch center. Are you sure you don't need the police? No, sir. I was just having a temper tantrum and I was mad. Ma'am? Yes. You really don't need it. Tell me a number between 1 and 5. Okay. 6.
Okay, so as you can see, that was very similar to Francesca and Betsy's examples and personal experiences that they had with a 911 call. You know, he says that, I hope everybody could hear that okay, but he says at the end, I think he had a feeling, he had a gut feeling, and oftentimes I think this is really the situation in which, and I think if you understand family violence and the dynamics of power and control and really what happens in those relationships, it's easier for you to cue into something that just may not be right, just doesn't look right. We actually have a coordinator that talks about that. JDLR, just doesn't look right. But this just doesn't sound right, I guess. And so your gut may tell you that something else is wrong. And so at the end of the call, he says, if you're okay, give me a number between 1 and 5, and she says 6. So you may have to think outside the box a bit and try to help somebody by mixing it up and, you know, doing something like that. Another example that I think many people, it had gone around social media some months ago, or maybe it was a year ago or so, where a lady called into 911, but she acted like she was calling for a pizza. And the 911 operator did a great job of listening to her and asking her questions that she could answer, yes or no questions. So obviously the abuser is in that area, in that vicinity, and so it can't look like she is calling for help. So just be aware of those situations as they might happen. I'm going to go ahead and let's go on to this. So we went out of order a little bit. I apologize. Just thought it was a good fit.
All right, so then we've talked some about the victims, the abuse victims, but we also need to talk about the abuser. So it's amazing how well the abusers can appear calm, cool, and collected when interacting with others. Typically, it's in the abuser's best interest for family violence not to be identified by others, especially those in a position of authority. So consequently, their words and behavior may be crafted to dispel any suspicion of abuse. It's been said that abusers show Jekyll and Hyde personalities, showing one face to the community and another face to the victim. What they do, how they do it, answers for or controls communication for the victim, denies or minimizes the violence, and talks about his or her own problems, talks about him or herself as a martyr, and speaks disrespectfully, belittles the victim, and has a condescending attitude. Another point about the Jekyll and Hyde personality is that sometimes these abusers may attempt to schmooze, as we say, authority figures. So as telecommunicators, we should be aware that this is a possibility. But at the same time, we need to remain neutral and not take sides. And as far as the schmoozing goes, we need to be careful not to suggest or accuse the caller of schmoozing.
So we had the 911 calls, and then this is where we were going to give that example of the 911 call. There are actually several. If you go to this website, these are some we've listed on the call on this slide that we feel that are good for situations to give examples of. I think it's important, and you may use one or more of these. I think it's important not only to use good examples, but also bad examples. And this could be a good time in your presentation where you give information, like you play a call and then ask them, what was wrong with that call? What would you have done differently? So really start a dialogue and maybe a little bit of a training activity at this time. I believe when you go to this website, there are actually, I think, like 6 different audio clips of the calls, and they vary in length from, I think that one that we had was just a couple minutes, where there are some that are 10 or 15 minutes, and so it might depend on the time that you have during the presentation. One of the calls that is often used, and for those of you who are in the DV world, the domestic violence world, advocates out there, is the Lisa tape, and so that is also on this website. We wanted to make sure that when you do have these calls that you try to follow up, especially the Lisa tape. The Lisa tape is been used for years. Since back in the day when I started doing this work, it was used. And so Lisa was a young girl that called in to 911 because her daddy was hurting her mommy. And it's heartbreaking. So again, during the presentation, you might give a little disclaimer and let people know that if they need to excuse themselves or if they want to talk later, that you might have help available for that. But it is very disturbing because the little girl is obviously traumatized. She is sitting there watching her dad beat up her mom. There is information out there. I Googled the Lisa tapes and follow-up, and Lisa actually got herself into some abusive relationships, or got herself into, that sounds bad. She wound up in a relationship that was abusive herself. But later on, she did, the reporter followed up with her, and she was able to connect with domestic violence services in her area and did a turnaround. And so I think it's helpful to have that kind of follow-up, especially if you're doing an audio clip that is that disturbing. So you might try to incorporate something, but at least giving people some time, because some of the calls that you might listen to may be disturbing and may be heartbreaking for people to hear.
Okay, so the next part we want to talk about are kind of the nuts and bolts of the actual call. And I would say that as a 911 call taker, your interrogation of the incident can actually happen before you ask your very first question. As soon as you pick up the phone and you answer at 911 or whatever your local protocol calls for, you need to listen for the background sounds to try to figure out what the situation is and ask yourself, well, what do I hear that might be an indicator of family violence? What background conversations can I hear? And what that does is it kind of helps the victim's safety at the time of the call, because I've heard call takers actually say, ma'am, I can't hear you. You'll need to speak up. And the problem is they can't speak up because they're trying to be quiet on purpose so that they stay safe. So if you can pick up on some of that stuff really early in the call, it really does enhance the victim's safety. And obviously, safety of the victim should always be one of our priorities. Another thing is you want to make sure that you can stay on the phone with them as long as possible, especially if the abuser is nearby or has access to come back. You can always suggest that they wait at wait at the neighbor's house or wherever it is that they're calling from so that they can be safe in case the abuser does come back. While you're on the phone with them, sometimes it can be kind of hard to fill that time and those gaps. One of the things you can do is you can let them know about that you do have help on the way. You may need to remind them multiple times that there is help on the way. Let them know, how many officers are coming, and if you can, how long it will take them to get there. Again, it depends on your local protocol. And documenting the information, the things you hear in the background, the things that the caller is telling you. Make sure that you can document the words and what you're hearing in the background, because sometimes the notes that you put on the dispatch ticket can be used in court proceedings. They find that those are sometimes more objective and they're not dependent upon the victim's willingness later to participate in the court proceedings. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay.
Yeah, we had one commented that
I
having problems, but I heard you were speaking up louder, so hopefully that's helping.
Yeah, I saw that out of the corner of my eye, so. Okay, so the next thing we want to talk about is responder safety, because obviously victim safety is important to us. Responder safety is important as well. One of the things that we can do as call takers is to get as much information as possible about the situation and the people involved before law enforcement arrives. And some of that could be the full names or even the dates of birth of people involved in order to identify the history with them or recurrent issues. And that includes weapons offenses or violent offenses, orders of protection that may be against them. I know some dispatch computer systems are able to run that information automatically and can get you a lot of information back in a pretty quick time frame. So as we all know, family violence and domestic issues can be particularly dangerous for law enforcement. So these are some of the things that we really need to take into consideration while we have the caller on the phone. Get as much information as you can. Some of the factors that go into this is that the abuse occurs over a period of time. Like I said before, it's not just a single event, and then it does escalate. So by having some of that historical data, you're able to protect your responders a little bit better.
And that could be asking questions like, has this ever happened before? Again, the 911 tapes are recorded. So we have to think about, yes, priority is the victim's safety, the officer's safety, but also that's good information for the officers to know and for later on during the court proceedings.
The next thing we want to talk about is how we interact with the caller, because the caller may be feeling somewhat hesitant to give you all the details. So again, we may need to make sure we're asking the right questions. They may be very emotional. I mean, this is someone that they're close to. This is someone that they're emotionally invested in, and now they're feeling hurt or physically hurt, and they may not be able to provide you all the information because they're so upset. So one of the things that we need to do is try to calm the person down and ask them the questions that they're able to answer at that time. We do have a handout that goes with this slide that you might be interested in. I'm not sure, Mary, if you could pull that one up. It's the techniques for telecommunicators on difficult calls.
Yeah, let me,
that one.
Finding it. I think we have it up here, yep.
Okay. And this just goes through gaining control of the emergency call while still being an active listener. Because obviously we want to gain control of the call so that we can get the information, but we need to pay attention to what they're saying and how they're saying it, so we don't want to be too controlling. We also give you some techniques here on calming techniques, and those include things like use action with reason, such as, ma'am, I need you to tell me your address so that help can find you. You tell them what you need them to do and why it's so important for them. Another one that we use pretty frequently is the repetitive persistence, and that would sound like, Mrs. Jones, go to a different room so you can be safer. And she's resistant, she doesn't do anything, and you just say the same exact thing again. Mrs. Jones, go to a different room so you can be safer. One thing that I would caution the 911 call takers about is to pay close attention to the message that they're trying to give you and not the way it's delivered. So if they're using a lot of swear words or if they're blaming you for not getting help there fast enough, remember that they're not actually blaming you. This is not personal with you. So try to pay attention to the message and not the delivery so much.
I often think about this in my experiences of working with victims, and often right after an incident, I would be one of their first contacts, either on a hotline or on the scene, and they're very upset and they may be lashing out at you and cursing or being disrespectful. It is important to understand the context in which that's coming from. You do deserve to be treated with respect, but they at this point feel safe with you. They are allowed now to say things. Why wouldn't they be angry for what happened to them? It's maybe misdirected, yes, but they take it, I guess, as a compliment, if you will, but they feel safer with you, and so therefore the things that they're saying are just acting out. They're acting out on the things that have happened to them, and they're not to be taken seriously or take offense to. And so some of the things that we've talked about along the way in the last several slides, I like to think of it as a puzzle. The caller's statements, the injury that they describe or the illness that they have, any background sounds or conversations that you might hear, other people's responses, such as the abuser, or maybe it's a child on the phone talking about what's happening. So those things taken separately may mean nothing, right? They may have little concern to you if you separate those things out. But what we're encouraging you to do is to look at the whole picture and put those pieces of the puzzle together. Again, understanding family violence and the dynamics of family violence is helpful because that will help you to really get some gut feelings or to understand what may be happening in that situation. You have them for a short period of time on the call, but it oftentimes is enough to put some pieces of the puzzle together to understand what's going on. So we can look at it as like a piece of the puzzle, or some people think of it as like addition. You're adding all these things up, and it could equal family violence. Also, the victim may have more pieces of the puzzle that you don't have. So you're concerned about their physical injury and their safety at this time, and the caller's not clear about what is happening, and they're not really concerned about it. Do know that at that time you have come into that person, like I said before, you've come into that person's life for a short period of time. This violence, as we've said, has escalated over the years to the point where the victim is really maybe unaware of how lethal it's become. It's kind of like raising the temperature in the water gradually and then it boils. You don't necessarily know as it's coming up because it is so gradually. The pattern of the behavior becomes very normal for the victim and the abusers, and it's consistent they both are consistently minimizing what's happened. The abuser may be minimizing it or denying it, and after long periods of time of a victim listening to that, they internalize some of that and minimize it themselves. It's important not to convey judgment during this time, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the presentation of what to say or what not to say. But why would they say in this situation, you need to get out of this situation? Remember, again, you're entering into a small part of the life. You have no idea what happened before or what may happen after. The victim has to decide whether it's safer to leave or to stay right now. Best example I have for that is back, again, years ago. I was very new. I think this is actually within the first couple of months that I actually started my career as a legal advocate for domestic violence victims. And I had a client who was abused by her husband, and after some counseling and encouragement, she left him. She got a divorce. She got an order of protection. He isolated her a lot and wouldn't allow her to have a job, and so she had gone out and got a job. She was entering the social world again and had friendships, but they had children together. And so all of these things happened, and she was set on her way, and it looked like she was really doing the right thing, like what we think that a victim should be doing. She went over to the abuser's house to pick up her children, so it was a visitation exchange, and he murdered her in front of the children. He stabbed her several times. So this is an example of leaving a relationship is oftentimes the most dangerous time for a victim, and they know that. They get a feel. They are in that cycle of violence. They are in that every day, and they know their situation better than you do, and what's safe and what's not safe at that time. So leaving is really not an event, it's a process, and I say these things just for you to understand that sometimes it doesn't make sense what a victim might do or what they might say or what they're concentrating on, but they have a whole different context to that situation than you do. Another thing that might be frustrating when talking to the victim is they may recall pieces of the puzzle out of order or not all at once. Trauma affects memory, and especially right after an incident, studies have shown that trauma can affect a person's memory so that it may be chaotic. It may come in sections, so they're talking about one thing. Again, it could be that's what they're focusing on at that point for whatever reason, but maybe they don't remember other things. Later in time, that might be something that they remember. They forget to tell you key information or can't talk about events in a timeline, and that's often the effect of trauma on memory. So it's important just to remember that and try to be patient. Again, like Betsy has said, repeating yourself for important information you need to get. Be patient as much as you can. I know that you're on for a short period of time on a call, and it is, an emergent thing that you do need to get some information. But it's helpful to have that patience with them and maybe try to rephrase things to get the information from them. It's also key to remember that trauma impacts the cognitive abilities of a person with a disability or even an older adult differently as well. And so that might impair them even more and their memory even more or even the way they're telling the story at that point. So we'll pause again for a minute to see if anybody has any questions at this point. Giving you a lot of information. Okay, well, we will move forward. Again, still, if you have questions or comments or any difficulties, please put that into the chat.
So now we'll talk about response procedures, how to handle these types of calls. And a lot of the information is, a lot of the steps are the same that we would use for, they're basic steps that we would do for just about all calls that we take. So upon receiving a call regarding family violence, the first thing we want to know is what is the emergency, and the exact location where we are sending help to. Now, of course, everyone has cell phones these days, so we can't rely on S911 info a whole lot to get exact addresses. So it's important to get the exact location of where help is needed. Next thing we want to know is who we're speaking to, get a name. Like, as we know, when we're talking to a victim or a caller, using their first name sometimes helps put them at ease a bit more. What number can I use if I need to call you back? Now, that's important too, especially with cell phones. Sometimes the connections aren't that great. We get disconnected. So we'll need a good number to call back in the event that we get disconnected. And if we have the address, if contact isn't made again, at least we can send resources. Betsy talked about that, how some jurisdictions have policy that even if contact is made on a callback, we're going to send resources anyway. And then tell me what has happened. We have different techniques, different ideas about this. Sometimes, as we've talked about, it's not very cut and dry. The victim may not tell us straight away what has happened. We have to come up with some clever techniques for asking questions and obtaining information. So the next slide, we want to find out if anyone has been injured, and if so, if anyone needs an ambulance, we need to contact EMS. Is the caller the victim? If not, the witness. So the witnesses and victims are going to give us different information, of course. And then is the suspect present? We want to get his or her name, descriptions, including race, gender, and clothing. And if the suspect is no longer present, possible whereabouts, where he or she could be headed, if he or she is in a vehicle, on foot, that sort of information, and then how long ago the suspect left the scene. An important question on the next slide is, especially for domestic violence calls, is are any weapons present? Here in Chicago, this question is mandatory when we get any calls regarding domestic violence, family violence. Our CAD system does not allow us to proceed in completing the dispatch event unless we enter information for that question. So are weapons present? Not necessarily is someone armed at the moment, but are there weapons in the home or at the location? If yes, what kind? And definitely include that information. Sometimes we bump that question up to maybe number 3 on this list of procedures. Has anyone there been drinking or using drugs? And what we tell our classes is that sometimes this applies to the caller as well, to the victim. It's not just, the abuser or the offender that we're concerned with. We know that drugs and alcohol can have an effect on the caller as well, and things could change from the time the call ends until the police arrive on the scene. Are there children present? If yes, how many and what ages? That's really important as well. And if anyone else is on the scene, are other people present? What's their relationship to the caller and or offender, abuser? How many people? And that's an officer safety issue as well. Police, of course, need to know how many, or what to expect before they arrive on scene. Have the police been involved before? I know some jurisdictions have the ability to, the information pops up instantly when an address is put into the CAD system. It may not be apparent right away, so the call taker may have to do a little research to see if the police have been involved before, how many times, when was the last time, and cross-reference any kind of name and address information to determine previous incidents. So just as we've talked about with listening and, quote-unquote reading between the lines, be alert to things that might indicate current order of protection or no contact order. Also, you know, for this last one, number 13, a caller may say the suspect or the abuser is not supposed to be here, not supposed to be where I am, not supposed to be near me. Those are all indicators that there could be an order of protection or civil no contact order involved. So a follow-up question to that we can ask is, who said he is not supposed to be around you? Another thing we want to bring up at this point is that there are, I guess, certain colloquialisms that people may use. I know here in Chicago we hear the same kind of phrases over and over again from during domestic violence calls. The caller may say, you know, if it's a woman caller, we will say, well, who's causing the problem? Who is he? And we often hear in response, well, he's nothing to me. You know, I don't know him, you know, that sort of thing. So that leads us to believe that perhaps there was a previous relationship between these parties. So one way to kind of get to the bottom of it, we've asked, well, do you two individuals have a child together? So they may have had a previous relationship, they share custody, or, you know, they're both parents of a child. They're no longer involved. So that's one way.
It looks like we have a question for, and hopefully Francesca and Betsy, you can help answer this. So Louisa asked, do you have any suggestions for dispatchers when taking domestic violence calls from children?
I would say, first of all, to get the child's name so that you can talk to them using their name. That sometimes makes them feel more comfortable. Try to reassure them that help is on the way and that the officers are coming to help the situation, because sometimes the kids are fearful that they're going to be in trouble for calling the police. So just kind of reassure them that the officers are there to help sort out the situation, and they're not there to make it worse. And I think just talking to them like you would anybody else, you know, you choose your words more carefully, maybe.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I think keeping the kids on the phone as long as possible until help gets there. I know that we try to do that with a lot of calls, but specifically for children, or if they have to get off the call, then to leave the phone open, leave the line open so that you could hear what is going on.
Yes, I agree with that. I think that's a really good idea. Try to keep the child on the line, and as Betsy said, sometimes the children are afraid that they're going to be in trouble for calling the police. So if you keep them on the phone and you're still on the line with them when the police arrive, you can assure the child that it's okay to go and let them in, you know, to open the door or what have you.
You know, additionally, and something that kind of building off of what Betsy said is, you know, reassuring them that help is on their way and the officers are going to help. Kids, again, may think that they're in trouble for calling the police. Maybe dad or mom has said something like, you know, don't call, no way. But tell them that, you know, thank you. Thank them for calling. Thank you for calling. I'm here to help you. Maybe ask them, what can I do for you? Or ask them what's happening right now as you're going on and you're keeping them on the line. Okay. Any other questions while we're on? Okay.
Francesca's done a really good job of going over some of the very specific things to ask when you're on the phone with the caller. But in addition to the actions that you need to take, we think there are some considerations that need to be going through your head as a call taker when you're trying to assess the call. And some of the factors that go into that is the victim a child, a third party? I mean, it very well could be a neighbor that's watching this happen or hearing this happen. So just getting the perspective is sometimes very helpful. And remember that not all callers are the same. Some could be very calm, some could be very upset, and that doesn't change the situation or the intensity of the situation or the response that's needed. Another thing to consider is, like we talked about before, that the caller may not be able to speak freely because the offender is still there, and they might not be very forthcoming with information. So I think that that's one of the reasons that it makes it so dangerous for law enforcement to respond. Some new information that I got while we were working in this work group is they listed 5 factors that were found useful in predicting whether or not an officer was at risk when responding to a call. Number 1, if the batterer was unemployed, if they had damaged property in the incident, if they shared a residence with the victim, if there was alcohol involved, and if they displayed a hostile demeanor toward the officers when they arrived. And they said that the more factors involved, the higher possibility of an assault by the offender. So I think that these could also be things you might want to consider when you're on the phone with the victim or the neighbor. If they have any of this information, it could actually be very helpful to the responders. As far as the response side of it, you always want to make sure that you dispatch multiple officers to a domestic incident, at least whenever possible, and that you should make periodic checks on them while they're at the scene. Oftentimes you'll have a caller that will ask for the call to be canceled, like the 911 call that we listened to, the audio. We tell our people that they should not cancel the police response, but they should note it on the dispatch ticket, and that the responding officers should be given that information that the caller tried to cancel the call, because that sometimes will give them some insight into what the situation is and how the people involved don't want the police there, which is kind of telling as well. Can we go to the next slide? Thanks. One of the things that we have to make sure we do when we're getting information from the victim, especially the victim, but maybe even somebody in the house or in a near location, is that we have to verify that it's safe for the caller to remain on the line and to speak freely. And if they're not able to speak freely, then we have to go to our yes or no questions, and those are also listed on one of the handouts that you can use. It's called the Techniques for Telecommunicators on Difficult Calls. It's the one we looked at earlier, but it's the second page. And you can ask things like, are you able to speak freely? Do you need police there? Do you know the person who is there? During these questions, you still want to reassure the person that help is on the way and keep them on the phone and keep them as cooperative as you can. So I don't remember, I think it was Mary that said it earlier, that if the caller has to set the phone down, if they just absolutely cannot continue the conversation, have them set the phone down but keep the open line, because hearing that background conversation is very helpful. And like we said earlier, those 911 calls are recorded, and they can be very helpful later when they go to court, especially if the victim doesn't want to press charges, often because they're afraid. The court system can still use the 911 tapes and still prosecute, sometimes even without the victim. One of the things that we come across occasionally is when the caller is unable to speak clearly, and this could be because of a number of factors. So we just want to have you, again, aware of these to take into consideration when you're assessing the call that you have. It could be simply because of fear. I think we've talked quite a bit about that. It could be because of a disability they have, or because of alcohol or drugs, or it could be because they were injured. Mary, I think you can maybe speak to this a little bit better, but one of the frequent injuries that we have in domestic violence cases would be strangulation if the victim was choked, and that's something that may come across in the call that they may be hard to understand, and what they need to understand is that injury is serious, and you may want to consider sending medical help to them as well.
Absolutely. Strangulation is very serious and can result in death later on, but it can make it hard for them to talk. There's swelling in the throat, and it can cut off their air supply. Eventually could lead to death, like I said. You want to talk to them about how serious it is, even if they refuse medical treatment. And one thing about this, and I want to be sure you talk to the officers about this has happened. So when you dispatch, you want to make sure that they know that this has happened. Sometimes strangulation, it's not apparent that it happened. There may not be any marks around the neck, but petechiae can happen in the eyes. So the eyes, and there's different pictures. In the EMS when we did our EMS presentation, they had some really good handouts, some pictures of what that looks like, but you can tell that someone's been strangled by looking in their eyes. Regardless, you want to alert EMS as well as the police if anything like that was mentioned. Many people call it choking. My argument is you choke on food. This is being strangled. It just sounds a little bit better, I guess, if you say choking. It doesn't sound as serious, but it really is one of the most serious things that can happen to somebody. It's also an indication that the violence has escalated. So we talk about that violence escalates over time. Nobody goes on a first date and someone punches them and they stay in a relationship, right? And so it starts off with just pushing or shoving or name-calling, something like that, and then after a while, it gets more violent, more severe. When you hit strangulation, you've really hit that point where it is a very violent, very dangerous situation for that person. And so just to be aware that that's happening.
So if you come across calls where you're unable to understand the caller very well, it's not a problem if you just simply tell them to repeat what they've said, and you may include the language, something like, what you have to say is very important to me and I want to understand it, and ask them if they can repeat what they said. I think that anybody that's calling for help will not be upset by repeating it if they need to for you to understand. Another calming phrase that we found is, obviously, once you've gotten the responders on the way and you've kind of gotten the essential information out of the way, sometimes you do have some extra time on the phone with the caller, and they may need calming down whether or not the offender is there anymore. And the simple question of, how can I help you? Sometimes it's just a matter of they just want you to stay on the phone with them, or maybe they want you to make a phone call for them. And depending, again, on your local policies and procedures, if you're able to do that. We do have a couple handouts that go along with this slide, and they're communication tips and etiquette for communicating, and it does give you some extra information, some extra background information, some extra phrases to say. So if you're in one of the training sessions, this may be something you might want to have available.
Yeah, and this is specific to people with disabilities or older adults, and so this is the communication tips handout. And then we also, trying to find it, this is the etiquette when communicating with people with disabilities. And so this might be part of your conversation as you're talking about communicating with callers. So working with deaf callers, this again has been a lesson for me over the past year or so as we've started on this journey of the work groups and really reaching out to people with disabilities, specifically deaf callers or deaf people. TTY, so everybody knows TTY. You see that oftentimes when they're listing phone numbers, a phone, a fax, a TTY. TTY is really not used anymore, and so many of you might know, if you are a telecommunicator, that that's not something that you get very often or is utilized. Video relay services, so this is an option where a caller might sign or interpret with an interpreter, and then the interpreter verbally relays that information to the caller. I think 411 is it 711, is it? Whatever it might be, that's a helpful way of getting information to somebody. The text to 911, so this is where a caller texts a situation in a message area. Not every area has 911, but it is expanding, and I think it's something that is going to be used more widely as time goes by, just as people get the technology to do so. What we found was when we started the work group, so a little over a year ago, we started the work group, and we reached out to see how many areas in Illinois had 911, or text to 911. And what we found was, there were a few, maybe a third, but by the time we finished the work group, and so that would have been like January of this year, many more areas, we checked in again, and many more areas had adopted the text to 911. And so you might want to check with your local area to make sure that if you do or do not have the text to 911, or what kind of capabilities you have when talking with someone who's deaf. So talking about communication with callers, what do you say to victims? I think it's important to be compassionate. You don't have to be a counselor in any way. I think many people are intimidated by, I don't know what to say, I'm not a counselor, I'm not trained in that. I respond by saying just be a person, be a compassionate person. You need to build a rapport and gain some cooperation and information with them, so it's okay to use some of these phrases. So validating their feelings, letting them know, oh, that must have been scary when that happened. Just little things that you can say builds trust, builds rapport with that person. I'm sorry this happened to you. You don't deserve to be treated this way. You have a right to be safe. Help is available to you. Help is coming. How can I help you? I think Betsy had said that. I think Francesca did too. How can I help you? Specifically when you're keeping that person on the line, how can I help you? What can you do? What's going on? And just active listening skills. I know that this is sort of a fine line to walk with a telecommunicator because, again, they have to get important information in a very fast, quick manner and relay that information so help could come. But there are periods of time when building a rapport and giving compassion to the caller, it can happen, and it is very helpful. And I know many of you have probably seen that quote that people don't remember what you say or what you do, but they remember how you made them feel. And so this, again, is going to help them feel safer, feel like they are being helped and believed. What not to say to victims. So we touched on this a bit when we were talking about, the victim has more pieces of the puzzle. And there may be reasons why they're not leaving that relationship and still with that person. So things you don't want to say. Why don't you just leave? Why did you wait so long to get help? I think you should leave this person. What did you say that made them so angry? That particularly, the fourth bullet point, that what did you say that made them angry? I've heard telecommunicators say, so as we have gone through the power and control, we know that it's not something he did. No one makes you feel anyway. She didn't bring it on himself. This is his way of controlling, the abuser's way of controlling the victim. So another phrase might be, was there something, what started that conversation? What happened earlier today? How did this start, rather than what did you say to make him angry? Why do you put up with this? So if you really look at these phrases, and there are many more, but you want to keep yourself in check that you're not blaming the victim. And we just live in a culture in which we do that, and hopefully it's changing. I think it is changing. But we want to make sure that you're not blaming the victim for what happened. There is a handout. It's called Barriers to Leaving. And so this can bring on a little more of an expanded conversation about why victims stay in relationships, and kind of talk more about why victim-blaming statements are not good, or what not to say. I think overall this is just a really good handout that many people should just read. So you might think that a 911 telecommunicator may not have a lot of time to safety plan with the victim, but again, I think it's very important that you know what a safety plan might look like and understand that within the dynamics of family violence, and then know resources that are available out there nationally, statewide, as well as specifically in your local area. So a safety planning might be, and again, you may have opportunity to talk to them about, are there friends and family who they can stay with in the area? Know that there's a shelter in your area, or where it is. That could be information you relate to them. Counseling is always an option if they don't choose to leave, or if they are leaving, that counseling is always an option. Reporting it to the police, you're obviously calling the police and or EMS, and so you know that to be an option. and then considerations for people with disabilities. And so we have a few handouts on that as well. We have safety planning, and this is for people with disabilities. Might be a good thing to go over, at least hand out for people's information so they can review it later. Here's a safety plan. This is for anybody, and it talks about safety planning, if it's an emergency, how to make your children safer. So both emergent and then long-term safety planning. And then the last one is we actually have this in Model Protocol. This is safety planning, and this is just the front page of it. But this is a handout in there as well, and it's more involved information about safety planning with people with disabilities. So this is a slide that you would want to, your training team would want to customize for your local area. Family violence services could include domestic violence shelters or victim services. Go ahead and take the PowerPoint and drop the name of those shelters or victim services in your area, as well as the adult protective services and rape crisis centers. Like I said before, it's important to get either like a card or a brochure from a local agency to distribute. It's always nice to have someone on hand, possibly during your presentation, if that's even possible. One of the presentations that I had participated in for emergency medical services, at the end of the training, they had a panel of people from their local areas, so from the Rape Crisis Center, from Adult Protective Services, from the DV shelter. I think they had a prosecutor there, and they were there on hand to introduce themselves, explain their services, and answer any questions that they may have. So that's an option for you with the training. We also have handouts that are more of the national resources and information. And there's a backside to this one as well, but this talks about the both the national and local resources, such as state resources. And then another handout that's great when talking about safety planning and resources in the area is who to call. So many people get confused. They understand reporting child abuse, but when it comes to reporting abuse of an adult, that's oftentimes confusing. And so this is a really great handout talking about, first of all, who was abused, where did it happen, and then who do you report to, and giving those resources and information. There's also support services, and this is specifically geared towards people with disabilities or older adults. There's care coordination units within your area. Again, we want to customize this slide to make it specific for your area. Centers for independent living that might be helpful for people, as well as disability service providers. And again, 911 telecommunicators may not have all this time to give all these resources, but I think that it's good information for everybody to have generally, and you may have opportunity to do so. So this is the conclusion of our webinar. I want to thank everybody on the call for what they do. I know that really, especially with 911 telecommunicators, that it can be very challenging to have to know all of the different kinds of information for all of the different kinds of calls that might come in. But know that you do make a difference, especially in the lives of victims. Like I said before, it could be just saying something like, I'm sorry this happened to you, or you don't deserve this. And building that rapport, and people remember that. They remember the little things moving forward, and that may go towards their decision to leave that person or to find a safer option for themselves. So do know that you do make a difference. Are there any questions that anybody might have? We have about a half hour left. Oh, so we have in the chat, Gwen says, I think it would be important for 911 telecommunicators across the state to have the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline number. Absolutely. That is listed on the local resources. Absolutely. And have that at your desk. You know, that is an option for people to call. They can get information about their local resources, but oftentimes if victims don't feel comfortable necessarily walking into a shelter or into victim services, they use a hotline, and that's really their gateway, their introduction to what services might be like. And I've often talked to victims who have called the hotline a couple times, just kind of test out the waters and see what that was like. And that has encouraged them to seek help later by walking into their shelter or calling in and making an appointment to talk to somebody. Good, that's a good comment, thank you. Any other questions, comments? From Louisa, we have, what different challenges will dispatchers face with the new ways of reporting domestic violence through text or video? Oh, yeah, I think that I'll take it from a victim standpoint, and then Betsy and Francesca, if you could kind of chime in and help me out. But from a victim standpoint, I can see that the texting might be very good because for a victim, because they could do that privately. You know, you don't have to, the abuser may not hear them, and so they could privately text and it'd be less likely picked up by the abuser. The video, though, that would be a totally different ballgame when it comes to that. Francesca and Betsy, what do you have on the telecommunicator end? Any experience with that?
I would say one of the challenges for us getting information through text is that we lose the ability to hear what's going on in the background. We lose the ability to hear their tone of voice or crying or fear. So we lose a lot of the information, the nonverbal information that we get through a phone call. I think with text you get simply facts and that's all. The video part, well, and the texting as well, I think that it becomes a workload issue for the dispatchers because they're taking this 911 phone call, but they may also be dispatching the police department or the fire department, or maybe they've got somebody else on hold, so they're already multitasking. And a phone call that might take 3 minutes, now a text or video might take 5 or 10 minutes. So I think it becomes a little bit of a workload issue, although the benefits to the victims, like you said, you know, it's just great.
And a challenge here, at least for us, is that we don't have the capability. So we're going to have to rely on doing things the old-fashioned way.
I encourage everybody to reach out to your local 911 and find out what kind of capabilities are out there for deaf callers. Great question. Thank you, Louisa. Any other questions that anybody has? Information that they might want to share as well? As we sit in the uncomfortable silence. Thank you, Lynn. I'm going to give a couple more minutes just to let people ask questions. I know it takes a little bit to type. As we do that, this is just information about the arrest grant that has supported the project. And our different resources that we used. The work group had actually collected a lot of resources in this process, and so wanted to make sure that if you needed more information about that, that we could provide that for you. And then we have information on how to contact us. So please feel free to email, or you can call me. But if you had any questions or you need information about the toolkit or about anything that, with me anyway, anything about what the Illinois Family Violence Coordinating Council does and our resources. Should have put it on here, but I didn't. This would be a great slide, by the way, for training teams to put their information and any websites they might have. I neglected to put our website on there. But our website is www.ilfvcc.org. And I'm going to go ahead and type that into the chat. On our website, we have great resources, including the model protocols, and we have 3 of the toolkits up, and soon we will have the 911 toolkit up, so you'll be able to get those resources off of our website. We don't necessarily have a certification of completion of the webinar, but I can certainly, I don't have that already made up, but that is something I can provide if you need be. So just contact me, you can email me, and I can provide that to you.
Also, I want to note that we are recording this, so you can view this later.
Yes, we will have both the toolkit as well as the recording of this webinar. It'll be up on our website. So please visit. I encourage everybody to get on the website just because I'm proud of it. We did a total revise of the website, so it looks very different if you haven't been on for several months, and some great information and resources out there for you. Unless Francesca or Betsy has anything else, I think this is the conclusion of the webinar. I thank everybody for attending. Please feel free to contact with any questions. And happy trainings, everybody. Thank you.